Have you ever had those moments when you're there with someone, watching them struggle, watching them hit walls, watching them fall silent, and you don't know what to say? When your partner is at rock bottom, do you give them space or pull them up? This question, a woman answered it with 6 years of silence, in a way that most people couldn't understand. 1990. Autumn, in the New York suburbs. Larchmont, an ordinary rental house. In the early evening, the smell of stir-frying filled the kitchen. A 36-year-old man, dressed in ordinary home clothes, dropped some greens into the wok, gave them a few tosses, then walked to the doorway and sat down to wait. He's waiting for his wife to come home. They've been married for 7 years now. His wife is a microbiologist, leaving for work every morning and returning in the evening. And he stayed at home. His name was Ang Lee. That year, his bank account had only $43 left. That wasn't just a number. That was the sum total of 6 years of waiting. 23 years later, 2013. Hollywood. The Academy Awards ceremony. A 60-year-old man walked up to the stage, holding his second Oscar statuette in his hand, and facing the entire world, said one sentence: "I love you, Lin Huijia." Below, Lin Huijia just smiled faintly. From $43 to 2 Oscars. From cooking, grocery shopping, and taking care of the kids, to directing Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Brokeback Mountain, and Life of Pi. From his father's letter saying, "You possess mediocre artistic talent," to receiving standing ovations from film critics worldwide. How did he survive those 6 years? When every path outside was completely blocked, money was running out, and people around him didn't know how much longer he could hold on. What did he rely on to keep his sense of direction? And the woman by his side, how did she manage, during his lowest point, to neither crush him nor leave him? This is a story about when a man has nothing, what exactly does he live by? It's also a true story about how to properly treat a partner who's at their lowest point in an intimate relationship. Welcome to Fanco Decodes. I'm Fanco. Today, we're going to walk through the first half of Ang Lee's life together. The answers to all these questions begin with that winter of 1985, when a young man clutching a talent agency business card stood beneath the award stage. February 1985, New York University Tisch School of the Arts Film Festival. On the awards stage, the host called out a name, then called it again: Best Director. Best Picture, the same name. His name was Ang Lee. That year, at 30 years old, having just earned his Master of Fine Arts degree in film, with his graduation work Fine Line, won both of the most important awards at that year's film festival. Below the podium, a man in a suit walked up and handed him a business card: William Morris Agency. That was one of Hollywood's top talent agencies at the time, and their message was simple: "We believe in you and we'll help you break into Hollywood." Ang Lee took the business card, and his heart skipped a beat. Just a few months earlier, he had already packed up 8 large cardboard boxes, ready to ship everything back to Taiwan. Those 8 cardboard boxes were everything from his 7 years in America: clothes, books, script drafts, a camera, and a few videotapes he'd shot himself. Packing them one by one into cardboard boxes and labeling them carefully, it was an act of farewell. He said to himself at the time, "Go back and start over." His fiancée, Lin Huijia, was still pursuing her microbiology doctorate at the University of Illinois. The two were in different places, staying in touch through letters. In her letters, she said, "Come back. There are opportunities in Taiwan too." The cardboard boxes were packed and ready, sitting there waiting for someone to come move them. But after the award ceremony that day, he didn't call anyone to pick them up. He stayed. The moment he decided to stay, he stood in the hallway, still holding that business card in his hand. feeling something he couldn't quite put into words. Not quite excitement, and not quite reassurance either. More like he'd pushed open a door, but didn't yet know what was inside. 8 cardboard boxes, placed right there in the storage room. The decision in that moment seemed simple enough, but what it brought was a long wait. In the spring and summer of 1985, he stayed in New York alone. Lin Huijia wouldn't graduate for nearly another year. Every day he'd go out, to the library, to the movie theater, watching Hollywood commercial films, studying how those scripts were structured, where the pacing was right, where the turning points went wrong. He'd watch the films he considered good, twice the second time, specifically studying shot transitions and dialogue timing. He was accumulating knowledge, preparing himself. But once he was ready, no one gave him a chance to prove himself. He started submitting scripts, one after another, sending them out, waiting for responses, getting nothing, then moving on to the next one. Occasionally, a producer would write back, saying they were interested, and he'd immediately revise the script, working through the night, finishing it and turning it in first thing in the morning, then wait again. After waiting several weeks, the other party would go silent. He picked up some odd jobs on film crews, working as a script supervisor, as an assistant to the assistant director, helping people move equipment. It wasn't that he couldn't do the work, but every time he came home after finishing, he felt clearly that he was getting further and further away from what he truly wanted to do, not closer to it. This feeling was even harder to digest than failure. Failure is clear-cut. You can accept it. You can start over. But this feeling was vague. It wasn't about losing something. It was that nothing had happened at all. It was a very peculiar predicament. He wasn't some down-and-out nobody. He had education, he had talent, he had an agency, he had a level of recognition that others didn't have, but none of these things could bring him a single penny in his bank account. Couldn't get him a contract from the film companies, couldn't earn him a single "you did the right thing" from his father's letters. Glory and hardship weighed on him simultaneously. In 1986, Lin Huijia earned her doctorate. She secured a research fellow position in the pathology department at New York Medical College and moved from Illinois. Finally, the two of them were living in the same city, rented a small house in Larchmont, and started living together for the first time in a real sense. Ang Lee thought it was a new beginning. In reality, it was the start of another kind of waiting. A very practical question soon followed. Who would go out and earn money? The answer required no discussion. Lin Huijia had a job with a steady income, though she later described it herself as just a meager basic salary as a researcher. But, however meager, it was stable. Ang Lee had no income. He had scripts in hand, but scripts couldn't be turned into cash. Only occasional financial help from family could fill the gap. So their division of labor naturally took shape this way. Lin Huijia went to work, while Ang Lee stayed home. This thing happened without any formal discussion whatsoever, and just kept going like that. Being at home, what did that mean? Grocery shopping, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids. Their son was born not long after, and Ang Lee naturally became the one who looked after the child. He learned how to pick vegetables, how to tell which cut of meat was fresher, how to piece together a decent dinner table across different seasons. He took the kids to the park, told them stories, coaxed them to sleep. Late at night, when a child ran a fever, he'd get up alone to take their temperature, sitting by the bedside, waiting. These things, he did them seriously. But he never stopped writing scripts. In the mornings, when the child was asleep, he'd sit down at his desk, open up yesterday's half-finished manuscript, and continue. Sometimes when he got into the flow, he'd sit there for hours at a stretch. More often, he'd stare at those words, feeling they still fell short of what he truly wanted to say, then stand up, pour himself a glass of water, and sit back down again. Scripts were written one after another, sent out one after another, waiting continuing. Meanwhile, letters from his father arrived irregularly from Taiwan. His father, Li Sheng, had been the principal of Tainan First Senior High School. A man of upright character, he never approved of his son pursuing a career in film. In 1978, when Ang Lee was determined to go to America to study theater and film, his father had done his homework in advance. Broadway only had 200 roles available each year, yet 50,000 people were competing for them. He shared this figure with Ang Lee, meaning, "This path is nearly impossible." Ang Lee went anyway. From that point on, the father-son relationship grew more and more distant. Ang Lee later said, "Over nearly 20 years, I spoke fewer than 100 sentences with him." During those years in Larchmont, his father would occasionally write, the content largely the same each time. One letter was particularly direct. "You have mediocre artistic talent, and your honest, shy personality isn't suited for the entertainment industry. If the director's path really doesn't work out, you should pursue a career in education instead." Ang Lee folded up the letter and didn't reply. Then he sat back down at his desk and continued writing. His father's words, he had thought about them before. He just couldn't tell whether he kept persisting because he truly believed, or because he hadn't figured out what to do after giving up. Those two things felt different, but at the time, he couldn't tell them apart. Back then, he didn't know that this feeling of being pressed from both sides would later become the core tension in his films, his characters. Nearly every single one of them is like this. They have their own strength, yet they're stuck somewhere, unable to move. That was something he'd lived through himself. Those 8 cardboard boxes just sat there in the storage room like that. A person who had won Best Director and signed with a top-tier agency was now in a suburban rental house, learning how to chop vegetables, wash dishes, and coax a child to sleep. This wasn't the life he had imagined. But he didn't leave. Why didn't he leave? That question, he had no answer for it at the time. He only knew that in the evenings, he would prepare the meal, walk to the doorway, sit down, and wait for Lin Huijia to come home. That door, he didn't know how long he would stand here, nor did he know how much longer it would take before the world outside would give him a place. But he never unpacked those 8 boxes, not for 6 whole years. Every morning, Ang Lee got up at 6 o'clock. Lin Huijia left for work, and he'd walk her to the door, then turn around and come back to start his day. Grocery shopping, breakfast for the kids, washing dishes. This was the most routine part of his day. The child was still small and needed company, so he stayed with him, feeding him, reading picture books, taking a walk around the yard. When the child fell asleep, he'd return to his desk and write. In the afternoon, he went to the farmer's market. The farmer's market in Larchmont wasn't large. The regular shoppers were mostly housewives from the neighborhood, with occasionally a few elderly folks slowly picking through vegetables at the stands. He carried his shopping bag, walking past each stall, carefully selecting vegetables, exchanging a few words in simple English with the vendors, then paying and heading home. No one recognized him. Nobody asked him what he did for a living. He later said that during those years, the farmer's market was one of the places where he felt most at ease. There, he didn't need to explain who he was, and he didn't need to answer when there would be results. He was just someone buying groceries. The act itself was complete. It needed no cause, no consequence. But once he left the market, life wasn't that simple anymore. Occasionally, when fellow Taiwanese would come to visit, they'd exchange a few pleasantries at the door, asking what he'd been up to lately, whether he was shooting a new film. He'd say, "Writing a screenplay, almost done." The other person smiled and said, "Great, looking forward to it," then left. How long was soon? He couldn't say himself. How? During that period, Chinese artists drifting in New York, Each had their own struggles. Each had their own perseverance. Ang Lee's friend Tan Dun was playing violin in subway stations at the time, making a living through street performances, rarely having any spare money in his pockets. The painter Chen Yifei was washing cars for people at first, working while thinking about what he would create on his canvas. Tan Dun later recalled those days, saying, "It was very much like what's depicted in the opera La Bohème. Everyone came to New York carrying 2 bundles. But what they carried in those bundles wasn't luggage, it was unfinished business." When Ang Lee heard this, he probably nodded in recognition. They were the same kind of people, in the same predicament. It wasn't that they didn't work hard, it was that their hard work still had nowhere to land. The only difference was that Tan Dun's violin was heard by people every day, while Ang Lee's scripts, after being sent out, most of the time didn't even get a response. You could see one thing from these people. Back then, they were all at rock bottom, yet not a single one of them left New York. Not because they saw the light, but because they weren't ready to take another path. Ang Lee was the same. He later told the New York Times, "There was nothing. I sent out script after script, and most of them were rejected." That was the toughest period for Huijia and me. She didn't know what a film career looked like, and neither did I. Nobody knew. That was the truest picture of those years. At 5 in the evening, he'd finish cooking the dishes, set out the bowls and chopsticks, then walk to the doorway and sit down to wait. He did this for many years, waiting for Lin Huijia to push open the door, change her shoes, walk in, set down her bag, and glance at today's meal. He sat there, listening to the footsteps in the hallway, trying to pick out which ones were hers. He later told this story to others, using a metaphor. "It was like sitting by the door, waiting for my hunter mother to come home with her catch." That prey was Lin Huijia's salary for the month, the source that kept this household running. He said this in a self-mocking tone, but behind the self-mockery was the real situation. In those years, the money in the household was earned by Lin Huijia. This matter had never been formally discussed between the two of them. Not because it wasn't important, but because saying it out loud would actually be meaningless. What difference would it make if they did? So it just hung there in the air between them, both of them knowing it, neither saying a word. Every evening, the moment she pushed open the door, Ang Lee would already be waiting at the doorway. That moment was brief, but for him, it was the most important moment of the day. Someone had come home. This household was still functioning. No matter whether today's script was finished or not, no matter which film company hadn't responded again, dinner still had to be eaten. After Lin Huijia came home, she never asked a single extra question. "How's the script coming along? Any news? When will there be results?" She would eat, take care of her own matters, then go to bed early and leave again the next day. This silence was her way of handling things. Ang Lee later said that his wife's greatest support was her not saying unnecessary things. Not saying unnecessary things doesn't mean indifference. Not talking too much meant she had figured something out. Those questions, even if asked, had no answers. She didn't need to express care through questions, nor did she need to prove her presence through advice. She was simply there, coming home every day, going out every day. This act itself was a form of support. Ang Lee felt it, though he might not have been able to articulate what it was at the time. But silence, sometimes, also has its own weight. At night, after the children were asleep and Lin Huijia had gone to bed, the house would fall silent. Sometimes, he'd sit at his desk, not writing anything, just staring into space for a while. Outside the window was the Larchmont night. Occasionally, a car would pass by, its headlights sweeping across before disappearing. He had thought to himself, if this path becomes impossible to continue, what then? This question, he never spoke aloud. What he did say out loud was something else. something he'd kept hidden for many years and only gradually shared with outsiders later. I thought, if I had the dignity of a Japanese husband, I should have committed seppuku long ago. This statement was both a joke and not a joke at all. A man who couldn't get anything done outside and could only go home every day to cook and wait for his wife, keeping the word seppuku on his lips. What he was talking about was something weighing on his heart. It wasn't entirely a sense of failure, but rather something even harder to articulate than failure itself. He didn't know how much longer he would have to wait. He also didn't know if he still had the right to keep waiting. He was waiting for an answer. That answer wasn't in his own hands. Those evenings, he'd stand guard by the door, his son beside him, occasionally asking him something, and he'd answer casually, his eyes still fixed on the end of the hallway. That was a door he had guarded for 6 years. Outside the door was a place he couldn't leave. Inside the door was something he hadn't yet given up on. But during those evenings, as he sat there waiting, something he hadn't yet noticed was quietly happening. He was becoming increasingly clear about what kind of films he wanted to make. Those days of grocery shopping, those afternoons spent cooking, watching the kids and zoning out, those evenings spent waiting by the door, they were all turning into something. Those feelings worn down by everyday life, that silence hanging in the air, that vague anxiety of not knowing what tomorrow would bring, all of it was slowly becoming the skeleton and flesh of his later films. The strained silence between father and daughter-in-law in Pushing Hands, the unspoken emotions behind every meal in Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, the force in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, where you clearly long for freedom, yet find yourself trapped in a certain place, all of that came from that doorway. But at that time, he didn't know this yet. He only knew that the most recent crisis had not yet arrived. Many years later, Ang Lee mentioned something in a very calm tone, but everyone listening froze for a moment. At the most extreme times, clutching a screenplay, he'd visit over 30 companies in just 2 weeks, only to be met with cold stares and rejections. Over 30 companies, 2 weeks. This wasn't a one-time exception from a particular year, but rather a microcosm of what he experienced repeatedly throughout those 6 years. When the waiting drags on too long, a person will eventually be unable to resist shifting from passive to active. Waiting is draining, but at least there's still an excuse to fall back on. The opportunity hasn't come yet. Taking the initiative is different. After you make your move and fail, there's nowhere to shift the blame. He couldn't hold back anymore. He printed the scripts, put each copy into an envelope, made a list of companies, then headed out. Most of New York's production companies were concentrated in Manhattan. He took the subway into the city, going to the reception desks of various buildings, saying he had a script and wanted to find someone he could talk to about it. Most of the time, the receptionist would glance up at him and politely say, "We don't have any project needs at the moment. Please leave your contact information." He left his contact information, then walked out and headed to the next company. At the next one, it was the same response all over again. A few times, he finally managed to secure a meeting. He'd walk into their office carrying his script, spend 20 minutes laying out his vision, and then waited for the other person to speak. What they said was, "This project doesn't quite fit our current positioning, but we'll stay in touch." Keep in touch meant there would never be any follow-up. 2 weeks, over 30 companies. When he talked about this, his tone was flat, as if he were talking about someone else's story. But he actually remembered every single day of those 2 weeks. He remembers the motion of putting the script into his bag before leaving in the morning, remembers going over what he would say on the subway, remembers walking through each glass door. "That little flicker of hope in my mind maybe this one will be different. That hope was dashed at the first place, dashed at the 5th, and still dashed at the 15th. By the time he reached the 30th company, he no longer went out with that hope in mind, but he still went. The offices of those companies, he later felt, all looked pretty much the same. A big table, a few chairs, movie posters hanging on the walls, coffee cups sitting on the table. The person sitting across from him, in a suit and tie, with an appropriate smile, was flipping through the script he'd handed over, turning a few pages or so, then looked up and began to speak. The content of the conversation varied each time, but the meaning was always the same. He had learned that when the other person said a certain word, he'd know the meeting was over. That word was but this project, but right now but maybe later. Once but appeared, he wasn't really listening to whatever came after that. All he needed was for that conversation to officially end so he could stand up, shake hands, say thank you, and walk out. After walking out, he stood at the entrance of that building, took a deep breath, then glanced at his list, crossed off this one, and looked at the address of the next one. And so it went, one company, then another, then another. Over 30 firms, he walked right up to each entrance and walked right back out of every single one. After those 2 weeks ended, he rode the subway home, leaning against the train window, watching the dark tunnel receding behind him. He didn't cry, nor did he feel angry. He just felt a very heavy exhaustion. It wasn't physical exhaustion, but something else. He had tried his best, but trying his best hadn't been enough. The failure of passive waiting is the opportunity never came. That kind of failure can still be pushed forward in time, saying, maybe tomorrow will be different. Failure from taking initiative is, I went, but they didn't want me. This kind of failure is more concrete. It's not in the future, it's already happened. You have to bring it back home yourself, put it somewhere, and then continue the next day. He brought those rejections home, again and again. The rules out there, he gradually figured them out. Hollywood doesn't bet on people who haven't made a film before. It wasn't because those people weren't good enough, but because no one was willing to be the first to take the risk. That was a results-driven place. If you have box office numbers, someone will invest in your next film. If you don't, no matter how good your script is, it's just a stack of paper. This logic has a fatal flaw. You have no results, so nobody gives you a chance. Without a chance, you'll never have results. He wasn't the first person stuck in this trap. He had seen some directors from his cohort who started out full of ambition, then gradually fell silent, and eventually stopped appearing in the industry altogether. Where those people went, he never asked. But he knew it was a way of disappearing, a very quiet way. So quiet, there wasn't even time to say goodbye. He didn't want to disappear like that. But not wanting to disappear and knowing how not to disappear were two different things. So he changed direction. Instead of charging again and again at a door that wouldn't open, he decided to polish what he had in his hands. He dug out those rejected scripts and revised them over and over. With each revision, he forced himself to go one step deeper. Were the characters' motivations authentic? Did the dialogue leave room to breathe? Did the structure follow its own internal logic? He knew one thing. If the script itself was good enough, sooner or later, someone would notice it. He wasn't sure how long sooner or later meant, but he kept writing anyway. Over those years, he wrote more than one script. Most of them went nowhere, but he treated each one as if it were the most important one he'd ever write. Lin Huijia knew about this. Every day when she came home, she'd see him sitting at his desk, see the manuscript pages on the table that had been revised again and again. She said nothing, but she knew what he was doing. Beyond those rejections, he encountered an even more difficult situation to deal with. People who were genuinely interested in his script, but that interest never turned into anything. That kind of situation was harder to digest than outright rejection, because it gave you a period of hope. Hope has weight. It lifts your spirits back up and makes you start waiting all over again. Then, when that hope falls through, the weight transforms into something else, pressing down on your chest, harder to exhale than a direct rejection. He let go of those dashed hopes, one by one, and then moved on to write the next script. That was the only way out he found during those 6 years. Not finding a way to open the door, but learning to live better outside of it. That year, their account balance was declining. The day when that account would hit zero was getting closer and closer. There was one thing he hadn't told Lin Huijia. That was the closest he came to giving up during those 6 years. It came very quietly, like a reasonable suggestion, slowly rising up from somewhere deep inside him. That thought, he himself didn't know how long it had been sitting in his heart. At first, it was just an idea popping up occasionally. He'd push it down and keep writing his scripts. Later, that thought started to become more concrete. If he were to find a job, what would he do? He thought it through and landed on one thing: computers. That was around 1990, when personal computers were just starting to become widespread, and people who knew how to use computers were highly sought after in every industry. This was a visible path, with concrete skills, concrete demand, and concrete income. It was different from what he'd been chasing all along, that thing he'd pursued for 6 years, and still couldn't see where the finish line was. That decision came quietly. It wasn't a sudden breakdown one day, nor an impulsive reaction after being rejected, but rather a slow, rational calculation that gradually surfaced after 6 years of wear and tear. He started to think, perhaps this whole filmmaking thing was just his own wishful thinking, that he could actually pull it off. Perhaps his father's words were closer to the truth. Maybe he'd been walking this path for so long not because he was truly suited for it, but because he was too stubborn to admit he'd taken the wrong turn. That thought stayed in his mind for a while. He didn't voice it, but it was there. So he made a decision. He quietly went to the nearby community college, signed up for computer classes, and kept it from Lin Huijia. He didn't tell her, because he didn't know how to bring it up. Saying, "I want to learn computers," would mean saying, "I'm giving up." Those 4 words, he couldn't bring himself to say them out loud. But he had already signed up, already gotten the course schedule, already started calculating in his mind what kind of job he could find after finishing this course, how much money he could make, so that Lin Huijia wouldn't have to carry the burden of supporting this family alone anymore. He folded up that course schedule and put it in a drawer. He thought Lin Huijia wouldn't find out. But she found out. How Lin Huijia discovered it, he didn't go into details later. In any case, one day, she found out about him signing up for the computer class. She didn't fly into a rage, didn't interrogate him, didn't cry. She only said one thing: there are so many people learning computers, they don't need one more Li Ang. Just that one sentence, nothing more. Li would bring up this moment repeatedly in later years. He said it was one of the most important things he heard during those 6 years. But its importance wasn't because it was encouragement. The usual sense of encouragement goes something like, "You can do it," or "You've got this," or "Just hang in there a little longer." In those words lies a hidden assumption. "I'm not sure if you can do it, so I'm giving you a push." That's not what Lin Huijia was saying. She said, "There are plenty of people who study computers, but there's only one Ang Lee. In other words, when you do things that anyone else could do, it's a waste. Not a waste of money, but a waste of you as a person." She wasn't judging whether you were successful or not. She was saying, you're different from others, so you shouldn't be doing things that others can equally do. Encouragement pushes you forward. What she said told you who you are. Defining someone is more powerful than pushing them. After Lin Huijia said that, she never brought it up again, and she didn't do anything more about it either. The next day, she went to work as usual, came home in the evening as usual, ate dinner as usual, went to bed as usual. But he remembered those words for many years. After saying those words, he took the computer class schedule out of the drawer and didn't go to the classes. Looking back on that incident, he sometimes felt a lingering sense of fear. If he had gone to class that day, if Lin Huijia hadn't noticed, or if she had noticed but said nothing where his path would have led, no one knows. Sometimes, the most important turning points in life aren't grand moments, but rather some afternoon when someone casually said something, and it sets you on an entirely different path. That was in 1990. Of those 6 years, this was when they were at their tightest financially. Lin Huijia's salary kept the household running, but there was no cushion whatsoever. During that period, the number in the bank book kept going down. One day he glanced at it and saw there were only $43 left in the account. $43. That was all the money the family had. He put the passbook back and didn't immediately tell Lin Huijia this number. He went to the kitchen and started preparing dinner, listening to the wind outside the window, unable to figure out what to do next. Right around that time, some news arrived. A friend named Feng Guangyuan called to tell him that Taiwan's Government Information Office was soliciting excellent scripts open to overseas Chinese with prize money, and the prize money wasn't small either. When Feng Guangyuan brought this up, his tone was half joking. "Should we try to make some money?" Ang Lee heard this and didn't laugh, but he made a mental note of it. He thought about what scripts he had on hand that he could submit, and he remembered a story, one that had been sitting in his heart for a very long time, about an old man who comes from mainland China to New York to stay with his son, about 2 generations separated by time and culture, about all those things that can't be put into words. He decided to write it. Before putting pen to paper, he did one thing. He went and learned Tai Chi, practiced it seriously for a while. He wanted to internalize that feeling first, Qi sinking to the Dantian, overcoming hardness with softness, power hidden beneath a calm surface, put it into his own body first, then put it into the story. He practiced Tai Chi while writing that script. The story was called Pushing Hands. Pushing hands is a form of partner practice in Tai Chi. 2 people connect hands, sensing each other's force, moving with the flow, not confronting head-on, but borrowing strength. He felt that this was exactly what he wanted to express. That old man came to New York, couldn't speak English, didn't understand his daughter-in-law's culture, yet, in his own way, in this foreign place, he found a way to stand on his own feet. That kind of strength wasn't forceful, but resilient. He wrote all of this into the script. At the same time, he also pulled out another script that had been sitting in his drawer for quite a while about a Taiwanese family, about a relationship that outsiders couldn't understand. That script was called The Wedding Banquet. 2 scripts, at the end of March 1990, sent out together to enter the screenplay competition. The day he mailed them out, he walked to the mailbox, dropped the envelope in, and stood there on the street for a while. He didn't know if anything would come of it this time. He only knew this was all he could do right now. $43 left in his account, 2 scripts, 1 letter, 1 mailbox. That was the spring of 1990. He walked back home, started making dinner, and waited for Lin Huijia to come back. That door, he'd been keeping watch over it for 6 full years, and he still hadn't left. He had no idea that what he was waiting for would turn out to be the most important outcome of his entire life. After sending out the 2 scripts, his days appeared unchanged on the surface. He cooked meals, took care of the kids, wrote, and waited for Lin Huijia to come home. That motion he had been doing for many years. Waiting, he was already very familiar with it. But this time, it was a bit different from before. What he used to wait for was a call from some company, from someone he didn't know, who would one day call and say they were interested. That kind of waiting depended on luck, on whether the person was in a good mood that day, on whether the coffee on their desk was hot enough. This time what he sent out were the 2 scripts he was most confident in. Pushing Hands, he wrote it, after learning Tai Chi. Energy sinking to the dantian, overcoming hardness with softness, strength hidden beneath stillness. He wrote that feeling into an old man who came from mainland China to New York to live with his son. The old man couldn't find his place in this foreign land, couldn't speak the language, had no way to bridge the cultural gap, but he didn't back down, and in another way, slowly found his footing in an unfamiliar place. That kind of resilience wasn't something he imagined out of thin air. It was forged through those 6 years. The wedding banquet was a story he'd been carrying inside him for a long time, about a love that outsiders couldn't understand, about the unspoken tensions between 2 generations, those words left unsaid, feelings buried deep, conflicts no one knew how to resolve. These 2 scripts, he knew what they were. When the news came, it was autumn of 1990. The Taiwan Government Information Office sent a notice. Pushing Hands had won first prize for Outstanding Screenplay, with a cash award of 400,000 Taiwan dollars. The wedding banquet won second prize, with prize money of 200,000 Taiwan dollars. He stared at that notification letter, momentarily stunned. 600,000 Taiwan dollars. This was the first time in those 6 years that he had actually received real money from anything related to film. He folded up that notice, placed it on the table, and walked into the kitchen to prepare dinner. When Lin Huijia came home that day, he told her about it. She glanced at the notice, nodded slightly, then went to change her clothes. There was no loud celebration, no long conversation, but he knew that she understood. It wasn't until later that he learned something interesting had happened. When the review committee was evaluating those 2 scripts, one of the judges, screenwriter Wu Nianzhen, after watching Pushing Hands, turned to director Chen Kun-hao sitting next to him and said, "This script is really well written." The father-son emotions among Chinese people were portrayed so profoundly, it must have been written by an old writer from the mainland. But he guessed wrong. The person who wrote that script was a Taiwanese man who had lived in New York for nearly 10 years, survived on his wife's salary, and at one point had only $43 left in his account. That year, he was 36 years old. The prize money was in Taiwan. The award had to be collected in Taiwan, and the ceremony required his attendance. But a one-way ticket from New York to Taipei cost several $100s, a sum he couldn't afford at the time. He asked people to help figure something out. In the end, it was Shi Hui Chuan, an NYU alumna, who used her connections to help him get a discounted ticket from China Airlines at a price he could actually afford. He bought the ticket, set the date, packed his luggage, and set off. It was his first time going back after nearly 10 years away from Taiwan. When the plane touched down at Taoyuan Airport, it was early winter of 1990. He sat in the cabin, looking out at the runway through the window, thinking about when he had last left this place. It was 9 years ago. Back then he was 26, carrying plans to study in New York, packed up a total of 8 cardboard boxes, thinking there'd be results in just a few years. 9 years passed, and he received his first prize money from a writing contest in Taiwan. He could only afford the plane ticket because he'd applied for a discount. But the feeling in his heart wasn't disappointment. It was something else. He could sense it. Something had finally shifted. Walking out of the airport, Taiwan's air felt a bit unfamiliar to him now, a little hotter, a little more humid, but still carrying that familiar scent. He stood outside the exit, took a deep breath, thought for a moment, then hailed a taxi and headed toward the city center. In Taiwan, he met with Shu Li-kong, a producer at Central Motion Picture Corporation. They sat down and had a conversation. Shu Li-kong asked him, "Have you thought about making these 2 scripts into films?" He said, "Yes." Shu Li-kong asked, "So, what do you need?" He thought for a moment, then gave an answer the other person hadn't expected. He didn't want a salary. He didn't want an actor's fee. He only wanted to take the 600,000 Taiwan dollars in prize money he had in his hand, put it all in exchange for a real chance to start filming. He'd done the math. 600,000, if spent carefully, could support a simple but complete film. He didn't want to wait for more money anymore. He'd already waited 6 years. What he needed was that opportunity, not a contract with better-looking numbers. Shu Li-kong fell silent for a moment, then nodded. On April 10, 1991, Pushing Hands officially began production. The location was in Taipei. The crew wasn't large, the conditions weren't comfortable, and he managed everything on set himself, keeping an eye on every detail. During those 24 days, he stood on set, eyes fixed on the monitor. There was something in his heart that he'd never felt. During those 6 years, he was finally doing what he was meant to do. Playing the father, Old Chu, was actor Lang Xiong. Before filming began, Ang Lee actually felt a bit uneasy. Lang Xiong was a veteran actor with deep experience, and he wasn't sure if his direction could handle an actor of that caliber. Later, he didn't need to worry about that anymore. Lang Xiong entered that role, and he went deep into it. That old man who came from the mainland to New York, unable to speak the language, unable to find his place in a foreign land, yet gradually established himself through his Tai Chi skills. Lang Xiong didn't deliberately perform any of that. It seeped out from his very bones, overflowing from every gesture and movement. Ang Lee stood behind the monitor and took a deep breath. When he wrote that old man, he was thinking of his own father. He hadn't expected that an actor could bring something like that to life in this way. That unspoken weight between father and son in the frame, it was visible. 24 days later, Pushing Hands wrapped filming. At the 28th Golden Horse Awards, Lang Xiong won Best Actor for Pushing Hands, Wang Lai won Best Supporting Actress, and Ang Lee himself received the Special Jury Prize. The following year, at the 37th Asia Pacific Film Festival, Pushing Hands won Best Picture. During those days, when the news kept coming one after another, he would sometimes stand by the window, looking out at New York, thinking about that desk. He thought of himself, the one who would return to sit there every morning after dropping off his son. From there to here, that distance had taken him 6 years to cross. Ang Lee later returned to New York, walked into that apartment he'd lived in for several years, and sat down at that desk. The very desk where he'd written script after script. The very desk where Lin Huijia left early and returned late each day. The desk he'd returned to after dropping off his son. He sat there for a while, without saying a word. For those 6 years, he sat here every day, listening to the sounds outside the window, waiting for that sound of the key sliding into the door lock. A door had opened. He knew this wasn't the end, nor was it a smooth highway ahead. One film, a few awards. These were just a beginning. But that deadlock, no results, so no opportunities. No opportunities, so no results. He had broken through it once. That one time was enough. After Pushing Hands, he didn't stop. In 1993, The Wedding Banquet won the Golden Bear at the Berlin Film Festival. He stood on the awards stage, and sitting beside him were those people directors whose names he had read in film magazines during all those years in New York. The person standing on that stage was him. Standing on that stage, he paused for a moment, feeling like none of it was quite real. Then came Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. Then Sense and Sensibility. Then The Ice Storm. Every single one was a new language, a new territory. He never stayed put in one genre. English language films, he conquered them. Chinese martial arts epics, he conquered those too. Outsiders looked at him and said he was naturally gifted at everything. He knew better. It wasn't natural talent. It was forged through 6 years of grinding. During those 6 years, he had nothing else to do but write, but think, but take those characters, those structures, those murky accounts between people, going over them again and again in his mind. Those years were his tuition, except that tuition was paid by Lin Huijia on his behalf. For those 6 years, she left home every morning at dawn and returned every evening, never once asking him how much he'd written that day, how it was going, or when there might be results. She would just come home, change her clothes, and help him keep that household going day after day. There was one thing that always weighed on his mind, letting his father see it. Ang Lee's father, Li Sheng, spent his entire life as a school principal. He believed in tradition, valued achievement and recognition, and had clear expectations for his son. He had read those letters sent from Taiwan over the years. His father never voiced outright opposition, but he understood what the letters meant. You possess only mediocre artistic talent, you won't make it on the path of art. That wasn't a lack of love, that was a father, in the only way he knew how, telling his son, "I'm afraid you'll suffer." Ang Lee didn't look back. He walked through that door and stepped onto this path. His father watched The Wedding Banquet, watched Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, watched Pushing Hands. He later said that his father gradually came to recognize and accept him more and more. That recognition wasn't sudden, it came slowly, like someone watching a path they once doubted, finally admitting that path was real. Over the years, the letters his father wrote him carried less of that persuasive tone and more of something else. Father started asking him what he was filming, asking about his current situation, asking about his children. The way he asked it was a father who didn't know how to say, "I was wrong," out loud, so he found another way, tucking that meaning inside other words. Ang Lee understood what it meant. Between father and son, those things in the end aren't settled with words, but with time, with silence, with letter after letter, asking about the children and how life is going. Some debts are settled this way, but his father wouldn't live to see Brokeback Mountain. In February 2004, his father suddenly suffered a heart attack and passed away abruptly. Lee couldn't make it there in time and didn't get to see him one last time, but before that, during one of their meetings, his father had handwritten something for him. It was that consistently rigorous old principle, in a rare moment, expressing himself with something close to tenderness. What he wrote was, "When entering the mountains, there's no need to go too deep. When putting brush to paper, there's no need to make the strokes too heavy." That was a father, in his own way, expressing his expectations for his son, for once not telling him to stop, but telling him to understand the art of leaving space, to understand restraint, and know how to breathe even when he's gone in deep. His father never got to see Brokeback Mountain. In 2005, Brokeback Mountain won the Golden Lion at Venice, followed by the Golden Globe for Best Director, and then Best Director at the 78th Academy Awards. On the award stage, he lifted up that little golden statue and said some words of gratitude. What was really on his mind in that moment, he didn't say out loud. He later mentioned something, his tone very calm when he said it. "At that moment, when I went up there, what I was thinking about was my father. He's gone now, but I still carry that calligraphy with me. Enter the mountains, but not too deep. Lay down the brush, but not too heavy. He didn't explain those words, and there was no need to. Some things are meant for those who understand. Some words are meant for those who understand. In February 2013, at the 85th Academy Awards ceremony, Ang Lee won his second Best Director Oscar for Life of Pi. He stood on stage and said, "I want to thank my wife. I love you, Lin Huijia." That night, Lin Huijia wasn't there at the ceremony. She was at home, probably reading, or maybe already asleep. That was her consistent way. She didn't need to sit in the audience to be caught by the cameras, didn't need to appear at award ceremonies, didn't need to prove anything. But those words, spoken from that farthest place, traveled across the ocean and reached back to that home. What happened between the person who said those words on that stage and the person back home, outsiders only know the outline. But there's one thing that everyone who's heard their story can feel. He never forgot. During that time, someone asked Lin Huijia, "How did you make it through those 6 years?" She said one thing: "I just didn't interfere with him. Let him figure it out on his own." Floor. On his. When outsiders first heard this, they thought it sounded a bit cold. A woman supporting the entire family, yet saying she didn't bother with him. But if you knew what happened during those 6 years, knew about that computer class schedule, knew about those $43, you'd understand that those visits to over 30 companies in 2 weeks, you'd hear just how much trust was hidden in those 3 words. Let him be. She didn't rush him, didn't question him, didn't demand he produce visible results first. She just did what she needed to do, kept the household running, and then left all the remaining space entirely to him. That kind of trust wasn't, "I believe you can definitely make it." That kind of trust was, "I don't need you to prove it to me first." So the best way to support someone isn't to stand in front of them and say, "You can do it," but to stand behind them and give them a place where it's safe to fail. What Lin Huijia did was the latter. These two things are worlds apart. Later on, in many settings, he was asked about those 6 years. Every time, his answer was pretty much the same. He said those 6 years were the hardest time of his entire life, and also the most important. During those years, he had no results, no way forward, but he also never stopped writing, never stopped thinking about the stories he wanted to tell. That time, every single moment he sat back down at the desk after being rejected, shaped him into something he hadn't fully anticipated himself, not hardened, but resilient, like Tai Chi push hands, never confronting head-on, yet never leaving the arena. That quality later found its way into every one of his films. Sometimes he thinks about that table, that desk in the apartment, the sound of wind outside the window, the sound of his son playing, the sound of Lin Huijia's keys. The person who sat back down every morning after dropping off his son, the person who never knew when the door would open, the person who walked out of the 30th company, boarded the subway, leaning against the window, neither crying nor angry. That person, he knew. That person was him. He stood on the other side of that door, looking back at that period of time, and he said it was a gift. What emerged from that period wasn't just the script, wasn't just the story, but a kind of understanding of people, an understanding of what it means to waiting. It's not passive, it's not weak. Waiting is believing in the path you're on, believing in it enough to pay the price. Lin Huijia is the same. She waited not because she had no choice, but because she believed that man was worth waiting for. 2 people, each holding onto different things. One person guarded that door, the other guarded this home. They never made vows, never declared anything, but during that time, neither of them left. It was a way of journeying together that required no explanation between them, one person moved forward, while the other held down the rear. The one walking forward knows without looking back that someone stands behind them. The one standing guard knows without saying a word that the person ahead won't stop. That door isn't his alone to open. You have one too. You've had that period too, not knowing where the path is, working hard for so long only to be met with silence and rejection and doors closing one after another. In those moments, there was a voice inside you that said, maybe I shouldn't keep going. That voice, Ang Lee, had it too. On that night with $43, he had that voice. On that evening, when he walked out of the 30th place and got on the subway, he had that voice. That afternoon, when he folded up the computer class schedule and put it in the drawer, he'd had it. But he kept going. Not because he knew the door would open. It was because he didn't know, so he had no reason to leave first. For those 6 years, he kept watch at that door. What was on the other side of the door, he didn't know. He was just still there. At the beginning we asked, when he's at rock bottom, do we give him space or pull him up? In the end, we discovered that not pushing him is true love. But within that silence, how much of it is, I believe you can do it, and how much is, even if you can't, I'm not going anywhere. These two things feel very similar on the surface, but they're fundamentally different at their core. So let me leave you with this question. That person you're holding on to, or that person who's holding on to you, which kind is it between you two? Feel free to share your answer in the comments. I'm Fanko, and I'll see you in the next episode. Fanko Decodes.